Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 25. Why wait for the inevitable doom? That week was one of the strangest the lieutenant had ever witnessed, the parts he was allowed to witness. The afternoon of the 56th day, many older people came to the mansion after hearing about Director Heggek's morning visit, hoping to spend a few minutes pleading with the lieutenant. "I knew the colonel. I sold his mother Jatesy a baby gown intended for him. I used to be their neighbor. Mari was my teacher. My daughter used to have a crush on his Uncle Pato." But Slither wouldn't let any of them in. He was furious with the lieutenant for talking to Mr. Heggek. "What if he'd been armed?" he shouted at the lieutenant. "He could have had a long knife on him. You could be dead right now." The lieutenant knew better than to respond with, "Then we wouldn't be having this dreary conversation now, would we?" Instead, he watched from an upstairs window as person after person was turned away, told that if they wanted to appeal, they needed to follow the procedure outlined by Colonel Waynes. Slither requested updates about conditions, and at dinner time the first report came in. After the announcement the night before, 26 citizens were killed after becoming violent, including Guy Lannard's brother, who swore in front of Major Twig that he'd find and kill his brother before anyone could give the herbs to his mother. In his fury, he refused to listen to the major trying to tell him that the guide's mother was exempt from the decree since she was considered necessary. Lannard's brother was finally cut down after he grabbed a long knife and charged Major Twig. He was 49 years old. His 50th birthday was the 65th day of harvest. He'd been spared by 2 days, but that didn't matter. The tone in the village was considerably more somber by morning. The citizens realized there was no other choice than to accept the decree. That afternoon, a carriage carrying 4 men, dressed in blue silks with red cloaks, reminiscent of Guy Lannard's, arrived to announce that they were rectors returned to the world to provide spiritual healing in this time of need. Every village, depending upon the population, received a carriage or 2 of holy men to prepare them for the holy day. For the first time in years, people remembered that holiday meant holy day. Now it would be again, as thousands of older and disabled citizens would meet the great Holy One himself. The rectors positioned themselves throughout Edge, shouting praises to the Creator, the Guide, and General Thorne. They quoted passages from the writings about the great love of the Creator, his desire for them to be reunited with him forever, and his promises of great rewards when they joined him. It was the mention of those rewards that caught the villagers' attention. By dinner time, each rector had offers from families to join them for their meager meal, so that they could hear more about what kind of a deal they might get in dying. From the front stairs of the mansion, the lieutenant could hear faintly one of the rectors as he called out quotations that, according to the lieutenant's faded memory, seemed accurate enough. What he shouted was true, but the context was off. He met the rector later that night when he came to the mansion to assure him that General Thorne was concerned about his safety. The lieutenant recognized the rector, one of the most popular actors in the northern world. He nearly applauded that selection, assigning the greatest performers to where there may be the greatest outcries. At least actors found work in the new world. The rector was everything opposite from what the lieutenant knew a rector to be. The fancy clothing, the dramatic arm-waving, the casting of his eyes skyward as if in communication with something other than the ceiling, the fluttering of his eyelids to hold back the joyful tears which the lieutenant saw no evidence of, and a face caked in paints. The closer he was, the more hideous he appeared. Then there was the strange manner of his speaking, ranging from low and commanding to high and weepy as he related his calling to be a rector. All of it smacked of a hastily written skit by a romantic spinster. By the time the rector left, the lieutenant was nauseated, Slither was complimentary, and the guards listening by the front doors were moved to tears. The lieutenant realized the soldiers' responses were probably like everyone else's, so desperate to grasp anything hopeful about the dire situation around them that they latched onto the ridiculous rectors. It proved his theory again. The right man saying the right things could get anyone to follow him, even to death. No experience or qualifications necessary, just charisma. The first day after the announcement, the fort was filled with people begging to appeal their deaths. But by the next day, incredibly, no one wanted to appeal anymore. The villagers who had listened to the rectors extol the heroics of those who'd be willing to leave this miserable, bleak world had changed their minds. It was probably because they said even the roads in paradise were paved with gold. Soon the allure of dying a glorious death was more infectious than the pox. And it was guaranteed to be glorious, because the entire village would congregate around the mass grave being dug, so that those taking the herbs could do so while musicians, younger ones who wouldn't be dying, played a heroic march, and the rest of the crowd applauded and cheered the bodies falling into the pit. By the afternoon of the 57th day, the messenger sent to Idumea with the appeals for Colonel Waynes had only 5 requests. By the evening of the 58th day, when a master sergeant from the fort came to update Slither and the lieutenant about the day's happenings, he brought with him even stranger news. Now there were people petitioning to be allowed to die with their loved ones, so that they could at the same time inherit their solid gold mansions with solid gold carriages to ride along the solid gold roads of paradise. What was the point of living when dying was obviously better? At that news, the lieutenant stared, stunned, at the master sergeant. But Professor Slither chuckled. How many people are choosing to die? The sergeant shrugged. No exact numbers yet, because there may be more in the next 3 days, but so far we've received requests from nearly 400 people. Who, the lieutenant stammered, who exactly are we talking about? All kinds, the sergeant said. A few younger adults with small children who worry about them having to grow up in this miserable sphere. The lieutenant recognized that phrase from the rector. Never in the writings had he ever heard of the world being described as a miserable sphere. It had its problems, yes, because it was supposed to have problems, to test those who came to it. But the world was always described by the guides as beautiful, amazing, a wonderful creation for the Creator's children. Some of the last Gracina boys and girls who can't adapt to a world without vials, the sergeant continued, a lot of single people who currently have no love interests, all kinds of people, really. Why wait for the inevitable doom? He said, sounding almost convinced that death wasn't a bad idea. It's not as if things will ever get better. Nothing is inevitable, the lieutenant cried. We can endure this season and the next. Then by planting next year, we can begin again with crops and herds and... The sergeant's scoff stopped the lieutenant. Ugh, endure? Who wants to endure? There's nothing in that word that's appealing in any way. Honestly, I've been thinking about sacrificing myself as well. Do you realize how much work there's going to be to reclaim the world? They want to build roads over the hill to connect the eastern and western villages, but no one's volunteering to do it. No one wants to work that hard, and why should they? It's not like Sands can give us anything, so why should we care about their side of the world? And then the plantings? Tilling the land is back-breaking work. No one wants to do it, and I don't blame them. Why endure this existence when I can be living in a solid gold mansion at the end of the week? The lieutenant rubbed his forehead in frustration. Who says there's going to be solid gold mansions in paradise? That's illogical. And why would anyone want a solid gold mansion? Gold is too soft and malleable. It makes no sense. The sergeant glared at him. Do you doubt the rectors, Lieutenant Thorne? Their prophecies? I, for one, would find ways to be happy with a solid gold mansion. Think of how valuable it'd be. The lieutenant couldn't help himself. Valuable? What, you're going to sell it? To whom? If they pave their roads with gold, doesn't that give you an idea of how unimportant gold might be? Do you have any idea what paradise is about? Professor Slither, clearing his throat, stopped the lieutenant. He grimaced, knowing he'd gone too far again. He had to stop that, or he'd never achieve anything. I'm sorry, the lieutenant said. I'm just surprised at the villagers' willingness to do this. I don't doubt the rector's sincerity. He congratulated himself on the convincing delivery of that line. And I will do better to be more understanding of the situation. Slither nodded in satisfaction. The next day, the 59th, the lieutenant stood at the front doors anxiously waiting for the day's report, wondering if, by the end of the week, there'd be anyone left to help him unite the world again. Another lieutenant came by that evening to describe how the guide was allowing for anyone choosing to die to do so. After all, Paradise was far larger and wealthier than the world, and there was plenty of room there. The village was humming with excitement and plans about what they'd do in Paradise. The lieutenant later tried to calculate what the population of Edge might be by the end of the week, but dropped his quill in frustration when he realized the number was leaning toward less than half its original 6,200. By the next day, a new development was taking place. Those who would remain alive were now staking claims to houses that would be abandoned by those who would die. Not everyone was convinced Paradise would be better, especially when so much property in Edge would suddenly become available. The fort sent out soldiers again, this time to control the fights breaking out over who would get what house. Owners trying to write contracts deeding over their homes to their friends were stopped by those insisting that once they were dead, so were their wishes. The lieutenant wondered if the villagers who remained were more ambitious, aggressive, and scheming than those willing to die. Or maybe they were too cynical to believe the promises of the waiting wealth in Paradise. Otherwise, they'd be killing themselves now to stake claim to the best solid gold mansions. The lieutenant decided that whatever he was planning to do in the future would have to appeal to the most acquisitive personality still alive. There was plenty in Salem to covet. When the 6th day came around, the 61st day of harvest, and the last full day of life for many an Edge, a surprisingly early and heavy snowfall put a solemn hush over the village. But it didn't last. That evening was to be a great gathering with everyone in Edge, the lieutenant and Professor Slither excepted, of course, coming to the amphitheater for an evening of praises, music, and a last motivational speech to firm the resolve of all those willing to die in the morning. The lieutenant heard part of the speech that afternoon, because the rector who visited them a few nights before spent an hour locked in the study with Professor Slither going over his delivery. The lieutenant sat outside the door listening to the different inflections the actor tried, changing his cadence and volume according to Slither's suggestions. The lieutenant wondered just how much Professor Slither had influenced all of this. He was, after all, the one with a copy of the writings, and from the promptings that he could hear through the door, Slither also authored the speech. The lieutenant was struck with the thought, and he knew where it came from, that he'd never heard Rector Shin practicing his sermons. He'd spend hours each week reading and meditating, then composing his messages, calling on members of the congregation each week to share their experiences and beliefs with the congregation. But he never performed. Rector Shin didn't have the commanding presence of Colonel Shin, nor the boldness of Mari Shin. He was just a regular man, with a quick wit which he revealed only occasionally. But he'd heard Rector Shin say that as long as he prepared the correct message, the spirit of his words would reach the hearts of his hearers. No amount of posturing or gesturing could carry the power of his words more effectively than the Creator. The lieutenant listened with a scowl at the phrases that reached him through the door. The words turned to labored rhymes, producing an almost hypnotic rhythm when the rector paced their delivery just right. Your sacrifices are as great and heroic in scope as the first guide's was to give us all hope. As he died to fight the dark that grew, you too will die to give us hope anew. Your names will be praised longer than his. Your deeds will be hailed as greater than his. Your memories will linger longer than his. We praise you, we honor you, we adore you. Never mind, said the voice in his mind, that none of these people remember the sacrifice of the great guide Hiram, the first son of the Creator to die only 6 years after the Creator placed them here. It took only 3 years for the world to become corrupted enough to willingly destroy the Creator's chosen. The lieutenant smiled faintly at the voice. Today it was a most welcomed visitor, an opposing opinion he needed to hear. You'll shed this body which hampers and shackles you, which torments and plagues and troubles you. Your spirits will live unchained and free, as they were always meant to be, until they are again reunited with their perfected bodies. Bodies which, if they didn't skip those lines in the writings, they would remember were an eagerly awaited gift from the Creator to his children. But, whatever. You will receive mansions on high encased in gold, jewels, treasures, silks, and wealth untold. Exactly how does an intangible spirit wear jewels and silks? The lieutenant smirked. So, are all of you naked over there? He thought. He heard a cosmic chuckle. Ha! So you are listening today. So, what are you wearing? He thought back. I promise you, it's not silk, and I'm not naked. The lieutenant smiled and thought, can you believe what's going on, Colonel? Unfortunately, I can. And for once, I agree with Lemuel. I'm glad you're not part of any of this. This is why I didn't want you in Idumea. I understand. You understand some things, but not everything. Like what? You understand the depravity of what Lemuel's doing, and I think you also realize why. He's culling the herd, isn't he? Exactly. Smaller, younger herds are easier to manage than larger, more mature ones. You can control their movements, their grazing, even their breeding. But as detestable as his plan is, yours, Lieutenant, is also flawed. What you don't understand is that your plan to unite the world and Salem is not the Creator's will. The lieutenant closed his eyes in frustration. Why not, Colonel? Why can't it be? Why do you want to do this? Because it should be done. According to who? The lieutenant couldn't think of an answer that the colonel wouldn't challenge. According to you, right? Lieutenant, there's no need for it. There's no reason except that you want glory and fame. You want your name known forever. The lieutenant sighed. Well, what's wrong with that? It's not the greatest life, soldier. Everyone knew my name, and at times I felt I never had a private moment, not even in Salem. But what's really wrong with it is this. It's not the Creator's will for you. The lieutenant grumbled. Well, don't I get to exercise my own will? Yes, you do. You also get to experience all of the consequences of your will, too. All the glory, all the shame, all the pleasures, all the pain. That wasn't as good a rhyme as the rector's speech, is it? Suppose I should work on that. Please don't rhyme. Not really necessary. Trust me. Same with uniting the world. Not really necessary. Trust me. In fact, there's no way it can succeed. The world and Salem are far too different. It took your grandmother and me years to adjust to Salem, and we came willingly. Even after 25 years, we still struggle to make our hearts pure. Someone put 2 pine cones in my hand during a marking trip, and I just couldn't help myself. Especially when a young man across the fire wouldn't be quiet, no matter how late the night was. The lieutenant's smirk returned. I knew that was you who hit me on the head, General, he thought, remembering their last marking trip and the evening when Puggett was stabbed by the stick that would eventually take his life. The lieutenant had been telling his cousins and brothers a story, and out of the darkness he was rudely conked on the head by 2 sharp pine cones. I knew it was you, he thought, but I didn't have any evidence. His smirk faded as the voice continued. You can't take the world in its present state of mind and force it to live like Salem. Even though it's a far better way, the people of the world simply aren't ready or willing to live it. Nor would Salemites be eager to embrace the competitive and materialistic ways of the world. It would destroy all that Salem is. Bringing the two together would be like forcing you and Cephas to share the same bedroom. Bloodshed and destruction would inevitably follow. The lieutenant snorted softly. But, Colonel, he thought, somehow it could work. It has to work. Why? How? I'll force it. Just like you and Mugga forced me to see reason so many times, I can force the world to see reason as well. We forced you to see reason? Yes. Obviously it didn't work, did it? You left us, and now you're the son of Lemuel Thorne. It seems that forcing someone to accept your position only forces them to find new ways around it. The lieutenant stared at a small crack in the wall that he never noticed before. The next morning, the 62nd day of harvest, was the first observed holy day in years, requiring the few shops that still functioned to close for the day. Everyone gathered to the southwest of Edge, along the former banks of the river. The lieutenant heard about what happened later from Major Twig, since he and Professor Slither were to remain at the mansion under heavy guard in case anyone changed their minds. A massive pit had been dug, using the dry river banks as a beginning. Major Twig reported that the citizens of Edge came early, orderly, and almost with an air of celebration. Those preparing to die were dressed in the most lavish clothing they had. If a stranger, not knowing the nature of the day, had wandered into the village, he may have interpreted the proceedings as a fashion show primarily for older citizens. The 4 rectors assigned to Edge stood at regular intervals in front of the pit, holding boxes made of wood. Each rector had a thick handkerchief of red silk wrapped around his nose and mouth to avoid accidentally breathing in the herbs. 5 soldiers, with their noses and mouths also covered, accompanied each rector to provide assistance should any be required. The rest of the soldiers stood on guard, maintaining a wide ring around the riverbed grave and gathered villagers. Only a handful of the more than 3,000 people dying that day needed encouragement. At the appointed time, with the remaining musicians playing a well-known dance tune slowed down to be more majestic, those to sacrifice themselves began to line up behind the 4 rectors. The first in each line were 4 elderly women, who seemed to be trying to outdo each other in their dress and face paint. Or perhaps they were hoping to impress the Creator with their wealth and beauty. When it came time to open the wooden boxes which held the herb bundles, one of the rectors called out in a muffled but grand voice, "Who wishes to be the first to greet the Creator?" That was when Major Twig paused in his narrative. He said that recently he'd seen two squirrels fighting in an alley and was surprised by their ferocity, with screeching and fur flying and gravel kicked into the air. He said what happened next between those elderly women was more bizarre than that. One of the women grabbed the box to open it, but her neighbor, first in another line, saw the movement and rushed over to stop her. Apparently she'd been intending to be the first to paradise. Twig had thought the soldiers would be needed to assist those who changed their minds, but instead the soldiers tried to pry the clawing and spitting women apart. In the meantime, the two remaining women tried to pry the boxes away from their rectors so they could be first while the other two fought. One of the rectors finally opened his box, grabbed a bundle, and shoved it in a woman's nose just to get her to stop. With great pleasure on her face, she sighed and fell face first into the rocky pit. That brought an immediate end to the fighting. Everyone froze in place and gasped to realize how swift her end was. The only sound was the rustling from her fluffy dress as her body tumbled to the bottom. Twig said he worried what might occur next. The entire village stared in amazement, as if finally realizing that thousands of people would be dying, were dying right then, right in front of them. He was right to be worried. The old woman who first started the ruckus put her hands on her hips and shouted, "That's Sow! That's just like her to have to be first. Gimme that!" She grabbed the box out of the nearest rector's hands, pried the lid off with shocking strength, and inhaled deeply. Twig wasn't sure which hit the ground first, the woman or the box. The other two women quickly followed behind, the soldiers nudging their fallen bodies with their boots to send them rolling down the pit. It was chaos after that for the first few minutes. The rectors could barely hand out the herbs fast enough to get through the initial wave of eager dyers, each probably trying to be the next in line to meet the Creator. After a few minutes, a tall, stout man stood at the edge of the pit, held out his hands with a flourish, waiting until he had everyone's attention, then cleared his throat as he took the herbs in hand. "I stand here now as a mere mortal," he began in a dramatic tone. "In moments I will be at Paradise's portal." Then, with majestic motions, he took the herbs, inhaled, and fell gracefully into the pit on top of the other bodies. Major Twig paused again in his retelling, his face troubled. After that man's attention-getting exit, which everyone cheered and applauded, but of course he never knew it because he was already dead, everyone else felt they had to do something memorable. Some sang a few lines of a song, while others tried to create their own little poems while standing on the brink of death, causing those behind them to become impatient and hasten their passing so that they could have their 5 seconds of memorable dying. One man even tried to leap into the pit while inhaling the herbs, as if flying to paradise. Twig wouldn't go into detail, but by the disturbed look on his face, the final effect wasn't quite what the man was probably hoping for when he hit the bottom of the rocky pit. But he did get the job done. Twig's chin trembled when he talked about the families that decided to die together. Most young children willingly accompanied their parents, seemingly not sure what was going to happen, but a few became terrified when they saw the bodies piling up and they didn't want to do it. Twig sat quietly for several moments, struggling to finish the descriptions of their ends, forced by their parents who followed after. But his tone grew tight as he said, "Then there were the parents who brought their children, gave them a kiss, gave them the herbs, watched their bodies tumble away, then left. Those children weren't ill or deformed or anything. Probably about 50 of them were dumped by their mothers or fathers, who then walked away without another care. There are very few children left in Edge now." He sat ponderously, as if trying to figure out if that was a good or a bad thing. Not coming to a conclusion, he went on to describe how a Gracina boy and girl were passionately kissing as they breathed in the herbs together. Since they wore next to nothing in spite of the frigid weather, it was apparent they'd been planning to do a bit more together as they died, but the rectors were growing impatient. Mr. Hegick, the lieutenant's visitor, was one of the last men to stand in line. He wore only a simple work shirt and trousers, no face paint, made no performance, and said nothing to capture anyone's attention. But Major Twig did hear him mumble sadly as he took the herbs. "Please forgive me," he said to no one in particular. "I see no other alternative. You know, I've tried for days to find one. This isn't my choice." He looked to the forest and whispered, "Colonel, please be waiting for me." Then he sighed, inhaled, and fell into the pit like the 3,186 people had before him. "They're still covering it," Major Twiggs said in a low voice to the professor and lieutenant. "The soldiers should have the last of the bodies buried by nightfall. The dirt pile is freezing and making it difficult to move, but topping the pit with rock should help." Professor Slither nodded and said in an equally subdued tone, "Sounds like you did an excellent job today, Major. Very few problems, no disturbances at the mansion. The village has been peaceful for the last few hours. Your duty well done, sir." Major Twiggs shrugged as he stood up to leave. "I don't remember mass executions being part of my job description." He paused before he walked to the front door. "Professor, you said you'd remember what class you failed me in. I'll save you the bother. It was Structure and Duty in the Army, the most boring course you ever taught. On days like this, I wished I'd never retaken the test to pass it." He put on his cap. "If you'll excuse me, Professor, Lieutenant, I'm done for a while." The 62nd day of harvest had been a long holy day. Holy days were to be days of rest, but they rarely were for the guide, whose obligations tripled. By evening he was always ready for an early night. But not today. By afternoon he was extremely edgy, as he knew he would be. So did Calla and Mari. They could feel his agitation building all week, leading up to the dreadful day in the world he knew from the Creator he was powerless to stop. That was why Mari suggested that Lori, Sam, and their 4 little ones come spend Holy Day with them, and not leave until the next morning. Guide Zenas was going to need at least 2 babies to rock that evening to soothe his heart. Mari sat across from him in his gathering room in one rocking chair, cuddling Mary, while Shem rocked Maggie. Calla sat on the sofa, listening to them remember names. "Karna's widow's been gone for about 8 years, Mari said to Calla, who had asked. "But she would have fallen today anyway," she ended with a whisper. Shem stroked Maggie's soft light hair. "Mari." "Who?" she asked, cringing in worry. "Mr. Hegick." Mari whimpered and kissed Mary's sleeping head. "Didn't Henri see his wife's grave marker?" Calla reminded them. "She died maybe 5 or 6 years ago now?" "That's right," Shem said. Mari smiled faintly. "Then perhaps this was a good day for him." Shem kissed the small head sleeping peacefully on his chest and prayed that it was. "Colonel? Colonel Shen? You wanted me to be waiting, didn't you, Hegick? Here I am. Just call me Perrin. Everyone here does." "It's really you! For so many years." "Let me stop you right there. Actually, it hasn't been. You see, you believe you know everything that has happened, but I'm here to prove to you that you actually don't know anything." Wait, this sounds like it could turn into a debate. Isn't that what you told my grandson you were planning to do today? This is paradise, isn't it? Yes, it is. And you're one of the few who made it here. Would you like the tour? No solid gold mansions, but something much better. There are a few more people waiting for you that I'm sure you'll be happy to see again. Just right over there. Yes, the tour can wait. Shem grunted, and so did the sleeping baby he rocked. When she was still again, he whispered, "Do you think Poe Healy?" Mari bit her lip. "Oh, Shem, I don't know. He'd be in his early 50s now. Maybe he's still in the army, though?" "He'd have to be loyal to Thorn." "Then I don't know," Mari said miserably. "What about Serene?" she asked, suppressing a smirk as Shem frowned. Calla cleared her throat. The first girl who kissed you, right?" "And she kissed me, remember that," Shem said. His smile lasted only a moment. "I hadn't heard about her for quite a while, but she'd be about 63 or 4, my age." They were quiet again, looking past each other, thinking of names and people, until Shem said, "Who's on your mind, Mari?" "Tyria," she confessed. "I've been thinking about her for days." "Tyria?" Calla asked. "One of my favorite students," Mari smiled faintly. "She married Milo Rigoff," she reminded Calla. "Milo died after Karna and Fod, killed in one of those battles with Sargon," she said sadly. "We tried once to send a midwife scout down south for her, remember?" she said to Shem. "Of course I do," he said. "The Hafadi's cousin. She even talked to Tyria a few times, but couldn't get close enough to make any progress. I'm sorry again about that, Mari." "I know." She kissed her baby's head. "It was a dangerous place and a dangerous time. We tried to rescue her, but we get to try again in paradise, Mari," Calla reminded gently. "No one's ever entirely lost, you know that. We'll find her again, and all of them, the Hegex, Fods, Karnas, Poe, just over there. Perrin will find them, and once we get over there, we will help him. We'll still rescue them all." And that's the end of that chapter. Thank you.